Okay, so Steve Jurvetson is going to come out now for 30 minutes. He's going to talk about two potential pathways for achieving AGI. One is the bottom-up approach, design, approach that's being taken by evolutionary computing, for example, right now, and a number of other approaches. And the top-down approach, the engineering approach to it. So it should be quite an interesting talk. Jurvetson has been involved in these dialogues for quite a while now. He was one of the initial investors in Hotmail with his VC firm, Draper Fisher Jurvetson. And he's been in the field of nanotechnology now for quite a while. One of his recent investments that I'm really interested in is, I think, D-Wave Systems. Is that right? Yeah. They are one of the first companies that's trying to commercialize quantum computing. How many qubits do they have right now? They have about 16 qubits. So it's a pretty fascinating field. And hopefully he'll be talking about that a little bit more. Thanks, Steve.
Can you hear me okay? Oh, yes, yes. Before I start, I'm just curious about the audience's predisposition on this topic. I'm going to be talking about what I think to be two fundamental paths to AI futures, one of which is designed, one of which is built or evolved using simple iterative algorithms. By evolution, by the way, I don't mean biological evolution per se, but evolutionary algorithms, simple selection, variation over and over again. And I'm curious, if you think about the first artificial intelligence that is human capable, let's say passes the Turing test, a crude measure, how many people don't think that that solution will be primarily designed without any benefit of an evolutionary algorithm? Okay. Right, in the development or training. Well, maybe a quarter of the room. How many of you think you were designed? Same hands. I just wonder if there's a philosophical overlap. Then how many people, back to the Turing test, back to the Turing question, think that whichever approach wins, if you will, the race will be fundamentally based on evolutionary approach? Okay, a large number, maybe 2/3. Okay, I'm with that second camp. It's just, and then there's a fused methodology, and then there's Brad Templeton's bonobo uploads, which we'll get to later, which is my favorite of all possible scenarios. But in every case, nevertheless, I think this is an important topic not just for AI, but for a variety of fields and a variety of topics that pertain to how do you build complex systems that are robust and resilient. And so even though I'll be speaking mainly about AI, the thoughts started when we were looking at nanotechnology and trying to figure out which technologies would come to market first, which would be commercialized first, and had a similar series of epiphanies on why we think the biological approach will win. Well, just one slide on us. If you've never heard of DFJ before, we're an early-stage venture capital firm. So for context, I'm going to be mainly speaking about stories and anecdotes I learned from brilliant entrepreneurs, and not so much from big companies. We have offices all around the world. We manage about $5 billion, but we fundamentally invest in startups when they're just getting started, and they have big dreams and aspirations and want to change the world. And I'm just going to try to add some hasty generalizations to what we've learned from our entrepreneurs. So when we first started investing in nanotech, we had to, as with any new emerging field, ask the question, when will these technologies develop? What's sort of a pie-in-the-sky science project? What is a near-term commercial opportunity? And to make a long story short, the framework that sort of shook out for us is that there were two fundamental approaches to nanotech visions of the future. When I mean visions of the future, the big, bold visions, where everything costs $1 a pound and all kinds of, pick your favorite analogy. The top-down approach I would call sort of the semiconductor path. That was what Intel and IBM would talk about, the 20, 30-year march where you build a business from the top down and inherit interfaces of scale as you go down and have a business the whole way down. You can think of the miniaturization of the semiconductor industry and the MEMS devices that they're producing as steps in that direction. It's slow, steady, somewhat predictable. Much more radical and a bit unfamiliar for the semiconductor industry, where it's the bottom-up approach, using processes of self-assembly, dare I say bio-inspired models for how you build semiconductors or how you build micro machines. And in many cases, you can do things today that are much more powerful than the chip industry can do today, but we lack systems theory. In a lot of cases, we don't know what we're doing, and it's a little bit out of control, to borrow from the roboticists' terminology. But I think it's, frankly, an area that has much more power and potential. So in the nanotech area, we have invested primarily in that latter or bottom category and have found all kinds of opportunities today in energy, electronics, medical applications that are in some way or another bio-inspired or biomimicry kinds of things, where we're borrowing components from nature, we're re-engineering biology. Synthetic genomics is creating artificial life forms. They've already completely swapped the DNA of one organism to another and changed its phenotype, basically changing an organism from one to another. People are doing fascinating work in artificial evolution in the labs, and in fields like molecular electronics and in solar cells and others, a lot of progress is being made in self-assembly, like Zetacor's use of a molecule like chlorophyll to build a better memory chip, for example. So we're seeing current progress in borrowing bits and pieces of a bio-inspired model, what I call the bootstrap model in nanotech. So it begs the question, at least for me, And it did in the nanotech investing domain. Which would you bet on? Would you wait 20 years and just assume that all the bio-radical stuff will fail, or do you try to learn as much as you can about the bottom-up grown approach from which we know so little? And it's that latter that at least I find more intellectually interesting and more potentially powerful in the near term. And I would just I would sort of posit the supposition for today that the same is true in artificial intelligence. That if you think about any large complex system, it's more likely that some iterative algorithm, some simple algorithm, will be able to transcend the complexity of its antecedents more than we can think in our own hubris that we can design such a thing. When you talk about accelerating change in general and a march to singularity, I just want to highlight that the life sciences have just as much interesting stuff going on in accelerating change as do the IT industry. So the top three would be things we're familiar with: Moore's Law, Kurzweil's version of Moore's Law that goes back 100 years, and et cetera. And we're all familiar with how accelerating change is occurring in the information technology industries. But the bottom ones are in some cases more accurate, like Dickerson's 3D protein structures prediction. It's held remarkably true over 65 years. And in some other cases, they're accelerating more rapidly than Moore's Law itself. Makes Moore's Law look very flatline in comparison. I'll use genes mapped as an example, just to remind people how much progress has been made. This was the march up to the decoding of the human genome when Craig Venter challenged the US government in this race and did over half the project in the last year and restored this pinnacle of how many genes, in this case, how many base pairs have been submitted to GeneBank. And when the human genome was done, the thought was, wasn't that sort of the pinnacle of achievement? Why would you do more? I mean, aren't we just going to hunker down and try to understand that better? So you might expect that this curve would become an S-curve of some sort, but of course it doesn't. The prior graph ends kind of down there if you look at the next 5 years of progress. And clearly in the microbial populations, there's an enormous wealth of digital data. And this is valuable data, right? This is one proxy for how much information we have in the digital databases of the life sciences industry. And when you're re-engineering the information systems of biology, this is what you care about, is how many, in a sense, books and pages you can pull from. Certainly in the field of synthetic biology. Well, here's an interesting statement. In the last year alone, one team, Craig Venter, has grown this database tenfold. If you thought that was the top of the curve. And how did he do that? He went around the oceans, shotgun sequencing ecologies of microbes, the viruses and bacteria that are in the open ocean, found incredible biodiversity. Between the 200-mile span in open ocean, he found the genetic makeup of the organisms there to be 85% different in some cases. It'd be like tundra, savanna, Arctic wildlife, archaea. Pretty amazing. He's built the largest digital database of biology in the world. Just one example, not meant to be read, is clearly an eye chart, just the colors, which don't come out too well, but all the stuff in red at the top and down were unknown to science before he did his very first sample, right? He then went around the world, but he went to what he thought was the deadest area on the planet, in the ocean waters, that is, and dramatically grew, now we believe 100-fold, the number of known genes associated with energy transduction from the sun. Now, why did I bring that example up? There's a lot of compounding progress, almost a renaissance of learning going on in the life sciences and in genomics in particular, and I think it will shed some light on how we can build complex systems. I think these fields will interrelate. I already alluded to the fact that I think all the big unsolved problems in computer science and in nanotech and synthetic biology and in artificial intelligence are fundamentally at their core, how can you build robust, complex systems from a Santa Fe Institute point of view? And these two paths I've already mentioned. Now, the thing that I think is interesting is that I think they're very different paths today, and a very rich debate will be why? Do they need to be different? Can you perhaps in the future blend design and evolution, do a little of one, do a little of the other, mix and match wherever you want, take the strengths of one, avoid the weaknesses of the other? But I believe they're diverging. And once you march down one of these paths, not only does it have path dependence, but it makes it harder to go back to design once you start evolving, for example. But I'll share what I find as a very different point of view. And I see this in the writing of many of the luminaries in the field of artificial intelligence. I'll just pick one example from Jeff Hawkins' book on intelligence, which defines in this entire book sort of a pathway to AI development that I would describe as more the evolutionary path through a neural network modeling and iterative training of these networks. Yet, near the end of the book, he makes this Zowie kind of claim that we're just going to be able to do what I call cut and paste. That we'll just basically grab like your ability to speak French, or are you a political science professor, and just swap it out. Various subsystems of our intelligence and our capabilities, as if it would be that easy. And that is what a designed, object-oriented program should be able to do. But I would argue our evolved artifacts are nothing like that. Evolved artifacts are very different. And I'll be focusing primarily on information systems and networks as opposed to evolved other organs. And then that could be a side debate. Why is it that intelligence and networks this applies to most strongly? So here's what tends to happen. You get these emergent layers of abstraction, right? So the brain's great advance wasn't reinventing the neuron or reinventing codons in our genetic code. It was a bigger, more interesting organization of the cortex. And with the exception of mirror neurons, there hasn't been low-level innovations in the brain. It's been more the higher levels of abstraction. Some would argue now mimetic evolution, cultural evolution is the ultimate extension of the same idea. But it moves up to a different vector of indirection, something Kurzweil's spoken quite a bit about. Number two, I think, and this obviously others may disagree, but I believe that biological evolution gives us the only existence proof of a system that can transcend the complexity of its antecedents using a simple algorithm. So instead of just a leap of faith, oh, I'll make something smarter than me. Why? Well, I don't know. I'm just going to be confident I'm going to do it. You can actually look to an existence proof that says a simple iterative algorithm distributed over time and space, evolution, can do that. Problems, though. Evolution is not great for everything. The most noticeable one, in my opinion, is that subsystems within any evolved system are completely inscrutable to the designer, the person who built the system or the process. Many examples. When Danny Hillis wrote a bubble sort algorithm, meaning he wrote an evolutionary algorithm that then produced a bubble sort algorithm, it did a pretty good job. It was better than any algorithm he knew how to write. It wasn't world-beating. He only did the experiment a bit at a time, but it was completely inscrutable code. He couldn't figure out, spending quite a bit of time, on how it actually did what it did. How does it sort numbers? Similarly, for anyone who's worked in the old field of neural networks, when you train these things, the inner wiring network is completely opaque to the outside observer. The subsystems, if there are any, are hard to discern, much less cut and paste. Similarly, I won't go into wisdom of crowds, but a similar analogy can be drawn to the wisdom of crowds effect that recently has been written about, of why certain teams of diverse members are more powerful than any one expert on the team. So the point of all those examples is that Danny Hillis and other people working in genetic algorithms and artificial evolution can hone the process. They can learn how evolution works, but they don't learn about the artifacts that are created. They don't learn how an artificial brain would work just by evolving one. In fact, they're as inscrutable as the human brain itself, I would argue, in the future. And what they get when they run these processes are these black boxes defined by the interfaces. What were the training sets, the selection pressures, the I/O, if you will, the sensory I/O in the case of an AI, that within is completely inscrutable. Now, I would argue, and this is just a sort of a bold claim, I guess, without any substance behind it. It's just a gut feeling that there's never going to be a solution to that problem. That it's fundamentally like Wolfram's cellular automata, the interesting examples, where you have to run the iterations of evolution over and over again to see the results that will unfold, and there's no mathematical shortcut to the output. And for those who've read Wolfram, you know perhaps what I'm talking about with some of those rules, where there's this beauty that unfolds in the interesting cases, but there's no way to jump to the answer on those interesting cases without running the iterative algorithm. It's kind of like there's no reverse evolution like there is reverse engineering. You lose information as you go, you can't backtrack. So what is this dichotomy? To restate some of the points, when you design something, you have control, at least you think you do. But your systems are brittle. Anyone using Microsoft code knows what I mean. When you evolve a solution, it's a little bit out of control. It's like parenting. But you can, within their custom environment, that's a really important caveat, develop robust, resilient, adaptive systems. Now, they may be co-evolutionary islands. If you're evolving something in a computer system or in a weird test bed, it's only robust within that test bed. And the idea of differential immunity or taking something out of its custom environment can lead to catastrophe as well. So this brittleness point is only within the, quote, a custom environment. So it would, by the way, jump to the conclusion, we would want to evolve our AIs with us, not without us, because they would be brittle without us. Design only tackles what I call simple problems. I mean, Word, Windows, simple problems. And the thing, biology just keeps poking us in the eye, right? The human genome is smaller than Microsoft Office by far. And it tells you a lot about how they program and how we unpack code. And I would argue that's the only, in biology, evolution, as I mentioned, the only case where you can exceed the complexity of your antecedents. Problems, though, with design, or benefits of design, is you can understand what's going on. Modular reuse, object-oriented programming, people are familiar with that. The beauty of design is you don't keep reinventing the wheel, and you understand what you're doing. You learn about the artifacts. If you build a bridge, you know how bridges work. If you design software, at least if a single person does, they kind of understand how that piece of code works, and presumably could use that learning to do better and better design. So design is in and of itself a self-reinforcing paradigm of learning. That's why we learn about how to build things. This is why we learn engineering. This is why we go to design schools. We accumulate the learning of our ancestors, and that makes sense. Evolution is not like that. At least what you learn there is process learning. How can I evolve things better? How can I do directed evolution? How can I do all these processes that let things grow without knowing what I've grown? I won't talk about the bottom point. I think that's already been mentioned. So what are some implications for AI? Well, first, I don't think cut and paste portability works in the non-design world. If you're doing rules-based, case-based AI, whatever, maybe, but not in any what I think to be interesting projects going on with Hawkins and others. And in the case of Kurzweil, and uploading human consciousness, it can't just be the brain, in my opinion. I think problems like phantom limb pain with amputees is a very fascinating example of, if you're missing part of your sensory context, unbelievably complex things can happen in the brain and the rewiring that goes on within them. And uploading a brain in a box could have serious problems because the brain is just a subsystem of our intelligence. It is not by any means the outer boundary of it. And the sensory system, the sensory motor cortex is part of it. I mentioned the co-evolutionary islands. I think this is why robotics is so important, and some people posit if you don't have an AI that is coupled to a sensory motor context that we understand, like it interacts with the world as we know it, it's going to be an alien intelligence. And that might be okay, but we might not even know how to interact with it. The path dependence, in the custom environment, I already mentioned differential immunity. Path dependence is interesting. If you evolve a system, and the survival test every time over millions and billions of generations is who survived or grew the most rapidly or propagated against some criteria, one of which is survival, will it have a low-level reflex, almost like a limbic or reptilian brain reflex for survival, no matter how much you try to program it out at a higher level? So it's almost like in our brains, a higher level sort of control algorithm over a limbic, a reptilian brain at the core. Might any evolved algorithm, when it gets to AI levels, have a similar problem? Yeah, I mean, okay, race conditions. So here's an interesting one. This gets to the Brad's bonobos. You got to think who gets there first, and would you ever bother to reverse engineer an evolved artifact? If you look at how much effort it's taking to understand how the brain works and the subsystems of the brain, it's a lot of human effort over a long period of time. Imagine you evolved something comparably complex that looked nothing like the human brain. Would you take out 10, 20, 30 years to try to reverse engineer it, or would you just run a few more years of the iterative evolutionary algorithm and make it better and better and better? I would argue you would. And unless forced to by regulation, why would you ever bother to stop and reverse engineer anything that you've evolved? You just keep going. And if you do that, it's sort of a first mover advantage of immense proportions there. And if you're trying to augment intelligence, you're never going to catch up with those that create the alien intelligence and let it run on the rapid rate at which artificial evolution can run on computational systems versus the biological substrate of reproduction, just deathly slow. And then lastly, on the uploads, before you upload humans, for those who haven't heard it, you're probably going to do animal tests on primates. Make sure they're bonobos, not chimpanzees. This is thanks to Brad Templeton and his quirky sense of humor. The the sort of bisexual sisterhoods of bonobos are just a much more friendly, base upon which you'd want to let these things propagate than chimpanzees, which are incredibly aggressive. And once you upload a primate and start accelerating that pace of change, why, the human upload, if it's a few years later, might not ever catch up. Something to think about in the Kurzweil world. So where are we today? Just a couple slides and then I'll end. This bottoms-up approach isn't just theory. There's a guy, John Koza, a single guy, running an enormous server farm of low-cost computers. And you can go to the website geneticprogramming.org to see it. He has 23 patented inventions already, 21 of which reproduced patents other people did, but he did it completely in a black box, 2 of which he's gotten patents on that were de novo. And what he does is, it's a complex flowchart, but it's actually quite simple. It's just create a random set of programs, just random bits, mutate them randomly, have them reproduce randomly, and test which does the better job at whatever use he wants. Analog circuit design and antenna design were the 2 initial areas. His quote at the bottom, he believes he can now routinely deliver human competitive machine intelligence. It's a bold statement, but in an existing domain, a limited domain, not a general intelligence. Now, there's some fellows here in the audience who are doing some very interesting work. Todd Huffman from ASU and Texas A&M has found a way to scan a human brain very quickly. It used to take months, under 30 minutes for this mushroom bodies in the brain of a bee. It's associated with sensory associative memory. And so we're able to find the topology and understand the structure of neural circuits a little better than ever before. And that can feed into other work. Paul Rhodes, in particular, who's here at the conference, is doing these fascinating neural synthesis work, which is modeled on the human brain, where synapses are forming and breaking thousands of times a second. Ion channels are being modeled to incredible detail. In this case, we're looking at a single cortical column, which is the basic repeating building block in the cortex. We'll pull out here for a bigger picture. Oh, well, cropped off a little bit there. But in general, this is a completely detailed, low-level model of how the brain is working and is being used to self-organize for sensory applications and olfaction and such. And he can model how these things fire and do fascinating work today in a lab using, interestingly enough, graphic processing processors for the CPU. So he uses the NVIDIA cards for the workhorse on computation, not a Cray or anything fancy. Let's see if I can make this go forward. OK, so last concept before I finish. I asked at the beginning, is it A, is it B? And I think the most interesting question is, could you blend the 2? And Jeff Hawkins, in a way, was saying, hey, we'll just blend the 2. We'll cut and paste. So far, I don't see any evidence that anyone's figured out how to do that, except on some interesting corner cases. But it is a grand engineering challenge that lies ahead of us. Can we blend these? Can we sequence dual evolution, then put design over on top, like evolve an intelligence, then make sure it's friendly through a design approach? Can we even control or bias the direction in which things evolve? If so, to what extent? Do we have a theory, or are we just doing experiments ourselves? D-Wave I won't go into, but there's a very interesting sort of mind-bending opportunity there to make a great leap forward as well. And D-Wave is making great leaps forwards in quantum computing, which warps Wolfram's computational equivalence quite a bit. And when I asked Wolfram about it, he couldn't quite reconcile the existence of quantum computers with his framework. And that could mean some pretty big advances in how we do computation. I think the bottom point is the main one, and it plays nicely off Kurzweil's observation, that as evolution continues to go, we are in fact evolving the capacity to evolve. And I'll give one last example very quickly, which is a low-level kind of pedantic or pedestrian example, but it gives you an example how you could blend the two. It's a company called Genomatica that takes the E. coli metabolic pathways and wants to make some biofuel or some industrial chemical. And normally when you do genetic engineering or biotech, you splice new genes in, and the thing evolves away from making the chemical because its goal in life to get big and grow and propagate is not particularly aligned with the goal you have, which is make the chemical over and over again. What they do is knock out a bunch of genes in the metabolic pathway where the organism has to make more of the chemical you want in order to grow. So it's kind of a simple concept, but if you don't design the answer, but just say, make some chemical, a little bit of chemical I like, but make it that if you don't make this chemical, you die, and then have an artificial sort of environment where you just keep culling the fastest growing members of this population, in a week or two, you start with a product down in the red, which doesn't do much of anything. You engineer it, you get the green, but then you let it evolve for a few weeks, and you get a 20-fold improvement in the production of whatever chemical it is you want. So in a sense, you don't design the answer. No one knows, in the case of the blue bar, how it does what it does. All I know is they jump-started a process of evolution, literally natural evolution in the sense of real living organisms, in a constrained environment. And yeah, so it made some benefits. I'll end it with this slide then, which is a great quote from Danny Hillis in his little computer science primer, Pattern on the Stone, that I believe in. I think this is how we're going to get to the AI futures. If I was to bet on one of the two, and maybe someone wants to make a long now bet to make it more fun, I think something that allows us to move beyond engineering to create something we don't understand, but we understand the process of its creation, is our ultimate goal as a species, to propagate something beyond ourselves and to fulfill our own desire for symbolic immortality. Thanks.
So you are looking for a unification of evolution and planning, and I claim that Toyota does that every week.
Okay, so the statement was Toyota does it every week, the unification of evolution and planning. And the evolution is what? A series of experiments, and then they incorporate them.
They take ideas for experiments from janitors if they have to, and try them out.
Right.
And if they work, roll them out.
Yeah, so this is an interesting, I'm not sure if it would be a robust and extensible idea, this idea that if you just do a lot of experiments and accept the best of them, a managerial tactic at Toyota, that that's the same as evolution and design. It is similar to high-throughput experimentation. So when people do CombiChem or they use Affymetrix or Inomatics products to just run 1,000 experiments and pick the best one, it's a form of an iterative algorithm. But I think in the case we're talking about here, it's not one where the thing that you're evolving is a complex system itself. So like in the case of Toyota, what you're asking for is suggestions that themselves are human communicatable, right? It's sort of different than if you said,
Yeah, but the car is complicated.
oh, sure, but I'm pretty sure what the janitor suggests is plain English.
The car evolves over 2 years in an incredible way, such that even the folks who repair them say, you can never tell what the damn part is because they changed it in mid-model year.
Right. No, good point. Cool. Brad, uh-oh. This is going to be funny. No.
It's going to be a criticism. I mean, when you speak of evolved systems, I think your point really only applies to evolution of sort of what you might call the broad control system, the ineffable essence of mind that we don't understand because it's evolved and it's a black box inside. But surely design systems intend to be created by many components. Those components have, for lack of a better word, APIs. And you can evolve systems to meet specific specifications and goals by doing evolutionary systems until you get one that meets those goals. I mean, our ear consists of systems which detect certain sound patterns, and our eyes contain patterns which detect certain types of motion and certain types of shapes. And those things can be evolved and then plugged into controlled systems. Don't you think that sort of hybrid is likely?
Yes. So the caveat I meant to give and didn't elaborate enough. I know. I was hoping it'd be funny. I'm quite disappointed. was I referred to information and network systems, because there is a fundamentally interesting difference in the decomposability of, let's say, our own bodies. Right? The heart as a pump is much more understandable to basic scientists than the brain. And I think there's something about the inherent complexity of network topologies that are of the size that we are talking about that make it perhaps fundamentally a different problem than a subsystem that can be precisely defined by a few interfaces. So yes, you could evolve a component of an object-oriented programming system, right? And that subcomponent could be an evolved, let's say, speech recognition engine. Great example, right? That Kurzweil and others have done. You know, it's embedded within a traditional design framework of software and user interfaces, but the core engine may be a neural network, let's say, that's doing speech recognition. So I think that's the case. The part that and maybe I should pose it more as a question than an emphatic statement in that regard, is that I feel that there's a fundamental difference in networks that are the vanguard of the evolutionary frontier. Meaning, things like the brain, the internet, things that are pushing that kind of scale of complexity don't tend to lend themselves to decomposition of subcomponents as easily, and I'm trying to figure out why. So that was more of an observation than a theory, and I don't know if there's counter examples. Yeah.
There is one existence proof, or existence case of a unification of a top-down design and bottom-up evolution. I'm not sure it entirely applies here, but I'll just say it anyway. It's basically what happens with email, internet scale email. You had so I'm talking here about sort of market and competitive pressures, the sort of the evolutionary mechanism. You had AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy doing their own thing, proprietary islands, responding to customers' needs for over a decade with their kind of messaging systems. At the same time, you had sort of 12 years of evolution of the standards, very much top-down, SMTP protocols and so on. And as I said, so each of those had its own separate process, and then it took kind of a decade or so of evolution for them separately to then come together. The sort of proprietary islands adopted the standards and all got interconnected. So again, I'm not sure.
So what was the evolution, in the case of this email example, what was the iterative algorithm that was evolving?
The iterative process, or at least bottom up, was kind of private companies not sort of designing with any kind of a priori goal, just sort of responding to customer needs around features and sort of getting more people adopting it. So again, I'm not sure it entirely applies, but there is some sort of bottom-up and top-down process that kind of were moving along separate paths and did come together eventually. So
I think that has to be the last question, right? But I'll say, I think that may be a great example. I don't know, though, if in that case and others, whether there's a danger of a retrospective rationalization to say, oh, isn't it wonderful what came out of this random mix of human activity, and out came order and the best solution won. But was there a priori, goal, design, setup of this process where you've got, where was the design early on that said, we want to get to the communication system?
On the standard side.
On the standard side. Okay, cool. I think I was seeing a 0, so, okay, good.